Art, can we just meet Emma? Because some of us haven't met Emma.
Well, I assume she will hopefully introduce herself.
Yeah, but
Yes.
okay.
So Allison, let the chair be the chair, please.
Yeah,
let the chair be the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Clarkson. And good morning, everyone. For the record, I'm Representative Emma Mulvaney-Stanek. I am a new representative from Burlington. I'd like to say I represent Chittenden 6-2, which is the west side of the old North End and southern portion of the new North End, to give you an orientation. I'm pleased to be here this morning. And actually, I either know of all of you or I have met some of you. I have been involved in politics and did some lobbying many moons ago on minimum wage, literally 15 years ago. It makes me feel old sometimes. So I actually spent some time in then Senate Economic Development back in the day. But I'm here this morning because I reported this aspect of 159 for the House Commerce Committee a few weeks ago now. And I'm happy to give you a bit of a overview of what led us to this aspect of the bill, this portion of the bill, and answer questions. I also know you have several witnesses who are also planned on your agenda, who I also don't want to necessarily speak for, because a lot of their very useful insights and experiences and expertise went into what came out of 159. So I'm going to give you an overview and pass the baton when appropriate. So 159 has, obviously, many aspects to it, but I'll speak just to this particular section, section 12. And it started in a different formation that came out of a couple of House bills to sort of cobble together and really respond to the reality that BIPOC businesses in Vermont, especially after the experience of 2020, when ACCD attempted to resource, find, frankly, and do adequate outreach out to this part of our business community and Vermonters, there was a huge gap in knowledge, a gap in know-how, a gap in responsiveness, a gap in knowledge of what was needed to get BIPOC businesses ready to apply for these economic relief grants at the time, the first wave, if you will. There were similar struggles for women-owned businesses, but it was very starkly different. Disparity was very clear as a result of information that the partnership, which I'm sure Curtis Reed will speak to, and this, again, I'm going to pass the baton hopefully to him to go more depth, but the partnership did a very insightful survey after these BIPOC business grants went out to really point to and document what happened, where the gaps were, and frankly, what's needed so that we can learn from this experience. So in a nutshell, when we were looking at the core findings of that survey, that's really what we built components of this part of the bill around. So really acknowledging the fact that in that survey, and I encourage you to read it, one of the core findings was that for the BIPOC businesses that responded, many said they don't see a relevancy or a responsiveness and inclusivity within the existing business associations that are white-led in the state, so the traditional chambers of commerce, et cetera. They also really felt that there was a lack of meaningful relationship built between BIPOC business communities and the state. Just to be blunt about it, there could be more done. There could be more done to understand what the needs of BIPOC business community members are in terms of being able to procure and find state contracts, to be able to have the other business development needs met in a way that really meets where they're at. So in response, we created, we earmarked $100,000 to embark upon a BIPOC-led effort. So BIPOC businesses really leading the effort to define what would we do to build a stronger, more vibrant network, and how can the state really show up in partnership but not lead, because ACCD is a white-led agency and they will testify to such, at least Commissioner Goldstein said this to some extent, there's not the expertise in-house at the moment. So this was about moving resources and putting those most impacted in the rightful leadership to say and define what the state needs to do. So in this bill, we tried to really make sure there's flexibility. So we purposely use the word network because we didn't want to go forth and make a BIPOC Chamber of Commerce. That may not be what is needed, nor desired, nor helpful. Maybe there's a regional approach, because we all know we represent parts of Vermont here. It's very regionally different. There's some similarities, but there may not be one statewide approach. It might be a regional approach. You'll see reference on page 21 of 159 what section is this? essentially at the bottom of page 21, there's a small reference to the creation of a minority business development center. This was at ACCD's suggestion, because Vermont is one of the few states that doesn't have a formally designated, this is a federal designation, minority business development center. So you'll see the language here, nothing prescribes you must come out with a recommendation that points to one of these things. It was simply to provide, again, the flexibility and light guidance that these things could be considered, and please come back and make those recommendations. So further into that section of the bill, it gets a little more specific, again, at ACCD's request around timeline, around scoping, around how the RFP would be put out. Again, out of a real desire that this is out of the wheelhouse, the expertise of folks within ACCD, and they wanted guidance around what would we look at for a contractor who would do this work adequately, and also the selection process. You'll see intentional partnering for both the selection and the scoping of the RFP between ACCD as well as Susana Davis's office, the Office of Racial Equity, again, very purposefully to make sure that we're really leveraging the expertise within the state. You'll see a preliminary report and then a final report to really help to make sure we don't have another whole legislative session go by before at least some preliminary recommendations can come back to the legislature to see what we can be doing and really thinking about. I know at least in House Commerce, I wasn't there last session since my first session, but we are very frequently now talking about equity and asking questions around how does this impact BIPOC Vermonters and folks otherwise marginalized within our economic systems. And from what I understand, that's a bit of a change in sort of orientation and line of questioning. So in that spirit, we wanted some initial recommendations earlier rather than later in the next session to really inform our work. The final piece in here, and I'm happy to talk about other iterations if that's useful, but the final piece in here is around data. That also became very clear in many conversations around one of the reasons ACCD reported not being able to get word out around those initial COVID economic business relief grants was that they didn't know who the BIPOC businesses were. There's no data collected when people register a business, which is not the only data point, but just for that simple one through the Secretary of State, there was no requirement right now to give any demographic information, especially racial demographic information. So that hamstrings the government, the state, to be able to actually adequately get anything out to folks, especially in the sense of an emergency, right? Like a pandemic, to make sure people know about funds and short timelines and getting people what they need, especially on a first come, first served basis, which that grant program was designed on, which is a bit of a problematic piece of it. So at least knowing where folks are at allows also, I think, some better on-ramping of translation, of adequate services, of making sure applications are responsive and doable for folks in the field. So you'll see some coordination with the Secretary of State, who I'm sure this committee knows is about to launch a business portal overhaul, for lack of a better word. And I've been in touch a little bit with the, newbie question, Assistant Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary of State, Chris Winters, and they're already working on a pretty thorough list of sort of categories, which is very different than what is collected now within the Secretary of State. And the hope really is this goes beyond ACCD, frankly, and there's cross-agency coordination and collection and consistency on collection of data related to race, gender identity, so that all of us as legislators can make better informed policy decisions. So I'll pause there. Hopefully that's a good overview initially. I'm happy to answer questions or go into more depth on any piece.
Does anybody have any questions for Emma at this point?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning. Nice to see you, Emma. Question, in terms of your conversations with Chris Winters at Secretary of State's office, we've been obviously in communication with Secretary of State's office for years on the business portal. It's something that's been important to us in this committee. So I'm just wondering, to what extent do you feel like this particular issue is going to be able to be incorporated into the work that's already been done or will be done? Just to give us a quick, 1 minute, where are they at in understanding the need?
So while they came in to testify specifically about the business portal separately earlier in the session, when we reached out, when we were working on 159, he checked in with their little in-house development team, and this is right in line with what they're doing. And I believe they're about to launch something in January. So it seemed like a very well-timed moment to kind of affirm these are the pieces, very willing to look at categories and making sure that we're putting into the whatever the mainframe database, structuring the right categories so that we're not repeating things. For example, ACCD did have a checkbox on its application form for the COVID relief grants, but it was women and minority-owned business in one checkbox, which gives you not a whole lot of useful information on the back end, because there are a lot of white women-owned businesses and there are a lot of, you know, et cetera. You get the point there.
Yeah. Great. It's great to hear. You know, it's hard when folks are working so hard on a project for so many years and they never get any, you know, make any headway. And so it's really great to hear that they're getting closer to this, and just want to give a shout out to them for being open to continue to fine tune it. So thanks for that.
Yes, that's a program that's very near and dear to the hearts of this committee. So we salvaged it several times.
Mr. Chair, can you see us?
I cannot right now because I have the bill up on the screen, but I'm about to go back to seeing you.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Emma, thank you. I'm Allison Clarkson. We haven't met, so it's nice to see you. The community action agencies, in many ways, have worked closest with a lot of these populations. So there's a lot of data. Was there an effort in this work? I mean, great to coordinate with Chris going forward, but in COVID, we now have data that was collected during the course of the pandemic, grants that were being put out. Was there an effort with in-house commerce to pull and coordinate that access with them, because they have deep ties into this community?
Thank you, Senator Clarkson. So that'd be a great detailed question for the commissioner. I know that we even just as a committee have been sending information on folks we've reached out to as just legislators in this process of developing this bill, and have shared that list of names and contacts to start something more than they have now in ACCD. We did, of course, as much probably your committee, bring the capstone agencies in to talk about the micro business development grants that are also within this bill. And thank you all for the same support. And I forgot, the bill numbers are getting blurred now. 315, I think, came back with more funding there. And I will just note, you know, so those grants, to my understanding, are for low to moderately income Vermonters. And of course, BIPOC business owners run the gamut economically. And so, you know, this is a really effort for a wider scope to make sure that we are acknowledging all kinds of businesses, those that are, you know, have even higher profit margins, and what are their needs in this state, this white dominated state, versus those who might be interfacing with the capstone agency that might be more of a mom and mom kind of pop store. I hate the mom and pop thing. I try to change the gender assumptions there, but the small little, you know, tiny stores out there that would be usually probably a smaller budgeted kind of operation.
So I guess I'm reading the language of the section, and it seems, while it has a lot of detail and guardrails and requirements, I guess I would like to hear you to say in your own words what the charge is to this contractor in terms of what they're going to come back with in terms of a report. What is the major focus or the goal of the report?
Thank you, Senator Sorokin. So a few things. One is to actually convene. So right now there are lots of mostly new, a few well-established, like the Partnership BIPOC economically focused organizations. And what we saw, at least in our committee, is there's a newness of even just developing cohesion between those groups to coordinate. So one is to convene, to bring parties together who've been sort of doing things in a siloed nature so far. The other parts of the scope for them to return on their reporting would be around really informing the state what other both financial resources as well as policy changes would help remove these barriers. We heard a lot from actual BIPOC businesses through that COVID relief grant process that the first come first serve sort of model of having applications for any kind of grant or loan or whatnot from the state really precludes a lot of folks to be able to be at that starting line at the same time as better resource businesses. And I think there's a disproportionate impact on BIPOC owned businesses in that case. So looking at elements like that, like what are those policy pieces that are sort of sometimes I think the go-to ways the state rolls out programs, where are those barriers, and where can we name and better reflect on, is this really serving all businesses if we really look at, BIPOC folks? That also could be, we talked in our committee that state does have some history, as I understand it, of helping to stand up for the successful launch of associations. I believe the Mountain Bikers Association, again, this is a newbie moment, but has received a few years of, for example, funding from the state. I'm just using that as a more recent example. But for something as important as, the economic, both sustainability and well-being of BIPOC folks in Vermont, it seems like a really important area to have folks say, what else is needed for the state to resource? We know that they're not being well served by existing private, business associations and organizations. So what else is needed, and where can the state move resources in an informed way? So that's the other piece of what financial resources and policy changes mean in terms of their scope.
So was there discussion in your committee in terms of the amount of money and the time frame? I just say it seems like, I know we want to get things done quickly and have things ready probably for the next legislative session in terms of more mature ideas of how to go forward, but it also seems like it may not be enough money or enough time. Were there discussions about that? How you landed on $100,000 and?
Sure. So for the dollar amount, that came from some initial conversations with Curtis Reed when we were at the early iterations of what it would take, and sort of understanding if there was none of these organizations existing now, BIPOC-led organizations, have adequate staff to take this on, to convene folks and to do the work necessary, especially in a pandemic, to make that all work. So about $75,000 roughly of that would be enough to resource someone for a year. And we were thinking from July to July for the final report for that calendar year. And then some additional resources for translation, for ability to convene people, many of which who are not resource paid to do this work. You'll hear from some of those folks today, I believe. So that was where the $100,000 for this year came from, knowing that that's not adequate, and that our intention was not for this to be spread out over multiple years to launch something successfully, but this was to really resource enough to get it off to a good start. And the timeline piece, as I spoke a little bit before, was we felt a year was adequate to at least get some initial solid thinking there, because there are these groups that are popping up already around the state. So sort of harnessing their wisdom together would really give us some initially some good ideas of at least of enough of a final report for in a year, and some initial ideas in the earlier part of the session being February, I believe, is what we said for the preliminary report.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Okay, let's unless there are other questions, let's move on. Keisha, Senator Rahm helped me pull together this witness list, so I'm happy to let her select the next witness.
I was anticipating that, and I think it makes sense to let Mr. Curtis Reed go next as the person who has been most closely involved in the last round of funding that went to BIPOC businesses and is working to conceptually build that connection now, if that makes sense.
Okay. Mr. Reed, welcome.
Hey, good morning. For the record, my name is Curtis Reed Jr. I'm Executive Director of Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity. Our 30,000-foot vision is that Vermont be recognized as the epicenter of inclusive thought and practice in the United States. And our mission statement is making Vermont the most desirable destination for the multicultural marketplace. That being said, I think you should probably ask yourself, why is this important? Not for BIPOC businesses, but for the state. And as it stands, we have last year, there were 237 minority-owned businesses that contracted with the state. Only about 30 of those were domiciled in the state of Vermont. So there's a massive outflow of revenue, of dollars leaving the state that's going to minority firms in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Florida. And we never, once those dollars leave the state, we don't have benefit of them. We know that for every dollar that is spent and retained in the state, it generates 42 cents. So $10 million, there'd be 4.2 million that goes to sustain Vermont communities. So we're looking at this at sort of a macro level of, to what advantage is it to the state to have outside contractors do business with Vermont at the peril of our own communities? So this is the way that we're framing this argument as to of building the financial literacy, digital literacy of an organizational literacy of BIPOC businesses so that they can belly up to the bar for state contracts. And we know that those contract dollars, that Vermont businesses, and in this case, BIPOC businesses, that we're going to spend that money in our local economies, personnel, equipment, services that go to support Vermont communities. The reality is that a lot of the BIPOC businesses do not have the capacity to grow in that way because they lack relationships with financial institutions. And it might be an incremental bit of equipment that they need that would qualify them to be, to apply for a state contract. It might be, access to capital, access to information. And so this is the reasoning behind sort of this focus on BIPOC businesses, is that these are businesses that are in our communities, in Vermont communities, that can help sustain the economic growth and sustainability of those communities by way of state contracts. Right now, we're just letting money leave the state with contractors that are domiciled someplace other than Vermont. So are there any questions about why we think this is important before I move on to looking at the text of the bill? Okay. There are a couple of places. First of all, overall, we support the bill. I think there are a couple of areas that need refining. One of those is, how are we defining indirect versus direct cost? Translation services are direct costs. And the way that this is written is that translation services are administrative costs. In the context of the work, those are direct costs. I mean, administrative costs are office telephones, administrative personnel, accounting services, which go to support the organization. But in terms of the mission of the grant, translation services are an integral part of that. And so I would recommend that you take out the language that says that translation services are folded into the administrative costs. You should know that we spent about $12,000 on translation services for the COVID economic grant program last year. And you take 5% of 100,000, was that $4,000? That's not even come close to what will be needed in terms of translation services. The other area that is, that I'd like to split the hairs on this issue of data collection, and that the Secretary of State's office should be in the business of collecting data. There are limits, however, to the data they collect. We cannot force, government cannot compel people to tell them information that they don't want to be told or they don't want to have revealed. So there could be a mandatory question that they ask, but there has to be the option that says, prefer not to say. This is public data, and given the world that we currently live in, it is not far-fetched to think that some troll in another state, through a FOIA request, will find out who all the Asian businesses are, and then, create a campaign that would, begin to destroy the reputations, to destroy the markets, et cetera. So we want, and every business owner is making that cost benefit decision as to declaring whether or not they are, a BIPOC owned business or not. So I just want to sort of, and I've had this conversation with Winter, that yes, the question is really important, but we can't force people to answer it. That there are, and the most elegant way of doing that is simply by having, list of ethnicities and races, et cetera, and then prefer not to say, so that now it's different if someone is applying for a loan or for a grant where, federal dollars say that you have to designate who you are as an entity. So those are my 2 points, relative to the legislation. Timeline, we prefer to have 18 months. This is like herding sheep, or herding cats. Sorry about that. And so it's, and albeit that we have a substantial amount of information that is raw information, and we've not engaged in the substantive conversations around how best to serve the BIPOC community on a really practical basis. We have the survey data results, but until we actually look under the hood and engage businesses on these topics, we think we'll need a little more time for that. So I'm going to leave it there and have questions.
Thank you very much, Curtis. Does anybody have any questions for Curtis? Senator Rahm.
Thanks so much, Curtis. And so first of all, I just reached out to Miss Wei Wang, who's also a friend of mine, and didn't realize she had to leave early, and really appreciate the BIPOC professionals of color network in the state. They're helping a lot of young BIPOC professionals access, support each other, a network, et cetera. And that kind of leads to a question for me, Curtis. What would you say, what is amazing and also challenging is that a lot of groups have sprung up around the state because they feel isolated in the Northeast Kingdom and Chittenden County and Southern Vermont. What would you say your approach has been as you've, tried to build this communication network to have a table of sort of BIPOC organizations to help make sure no one's left behind?
Right. When I came to Vermont in 1978, I could count all of the folks of color on one hand in Windham County. We've come an incredibly long way in terms of population growth amongst folks, Vermonters of color. And, you know, we have I like to remind folks that we're not monolithic, but there's a continuum of socio-political economic thought within communities of color. The advantage that we have at Vermont Partnership, being as old as we are as an organization, is that we feel that we have the convening power to bring folks to a table. And to really have the conversation around, you know, and rightly so, that it's a network as opposed to a monolithic organization. You know, all of the South Asians that are in the hospitality industry already have an association. There are Asian attorneys in the state that do a lot of business with and for Asian-owned businesses. We have Weiwei's organization in terms of Vermont professionals of color, which are largely individual professionals, but who could be convinced and cajoled into starting businesses. We have a lot of businesses, BIPOC businesses, that were formed because of some form of discrimination or harassment in the workplace, but they love the quality of life in Vermont for their kids. And so in order to stay in Vermont, they felt it necessary to create their own business, working remotely, you know, building, providing services. So there's a whole range of experience. But I think one of our comparative advantages is that we've seen the growth of these businesses over the course of 40 some odd years. And I think are recognized as a neutral player, except for the fact that it's about the economy, and it's about building wealth, and it's about, you know, how do we, you know, I don't want to pay more taxes than I have to. So one of the ways that we can do that is by increasing the economic activity in our communities around the state by way of state contracts. I mean, there are other ways as well in terms of, you know, our work to increase the number of tourist convention goers to the state of Vermont of color to the state. That's one way. But for this particular project, we don't see we have no preconceived notion of what an organizational structure would look like at this point. And I believe, with the exception of AALV, all the other organizations that are out there are just getting their legs under themselves in terms of 501c3 status. I know Vermont professionals of color are on the road to doing that. Allied Vermont is another one up in the Northeast Kingdom. They have no status yet, no legal status yet. There's the fellow up in Burlington, Void. His organization also has no legal status yet. These are all sort of percolating possibilities. So I think that we would be probably well positioned to provide, you know, to mentor these organizations as they move into a more structured environment.
Mr. Chair, I do have one more question, but I know we're trying to stop at, is it 9:45? I can't remember.
Pretty close to that. We have Joan Goldstein coming in, but we can go over a little bit. So let's go ahead and ask your question.
Well, Curtis, you brought something up that's really important that I just feel like I've been screaming into the void here, but legal assistance for BIPOC businesses is so specific. I mean, we saw it again with Clemens Family Farm going before the Human Rights Commission, and just being one of the only multi-generational Black farms in the state, just constantly feeling like they're fighting legal battles. I can not think of very many BIPOC lawyers in the state, period. And I just wonder, how we might build the kind of pool of BIPOC specific technical assistance from legal, financial, accounting that's needed.
Yeah. Well, give us the bandwidth to do it and we'll make it happen.
I like that answer. Thank you, Curtis. Appreciate that.
And Mr. Chair, may I just tag in here?
Yep.
There. I know Terry Corzone's. It would be great because there's, of course, the Black Students Organization at the law school, which is very robust and growing that out. And my guess is there actually are efforts underway, and it would be great to check with Terry Corzones, who runs the bar here, because I believe there is I believe some aspects of this exist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much, Curtis. We're going to move on. Senator Rahm, who do you suggest go next?
Unless someone has a kind of burning need to leave, I would say our racial equity director, Susana Davis, probably makes sense to hear from her.
Mr. Chair, can I just say from one Windham County person to another, Curtis, it's really nice to see you. Really nice to see you. Thank you for taking the time.
Hey, it's my pleasure. And I'm going to sign off at about 9:30, but I want to hear Susana.
Okay, Susana, please join us. Welcome.
Thank you. Buenos dias, everyone. Susana Davis, Racial Equity Director for the state. I'm going to be extremely brief because I think that your other witnesses probably have much more impactful and insightful feedback to give on this bill. But I will just say that what's being proposed here, I think, is a big step forward for creating a more equitable field for small and not so small businesses in Vermont. Of course, there's always more that we can be doing, but I do see this as a positive step. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that oftentimes, when we talk about equity, what we really mean when we say, what I mean when I say equity is creating a situation in which race or ethnicity or any other, identifying factor is not a determining factor for your outcomes, right? So ideally, we will reach a point where we don't have to have initiatives like this because there won't be quantifiable and persistent differences in the outcomes of businesses owned by members of dominant groups and businesses owned by members of historically marginalized groups. Ideally, we will get to the point where you don't need programs with this level of intentionality because we won't have those disparities. However, we presently do have those disparities, and so it requires that we be intentional in addressing them so that we can close that gap. And I think that's an important point here. The next thing that I wanted to say is that when we consider the range of activities that ACCD does perform, I think a lot of people, myself included, don't really understand the breadth of their work. I'm still wrapping my head around it. And I think there's an assumption that there's a whole lot more that's already happening directly from and by ACCD in terms of technical assistance and other kinds of programming, when in reality, the scope of those services is often contracted to other partners for the provision of certain TA programs or what have you. And so what makes this an important proposal is that it shapes the initiative that would be targeted at business owners of color by crowdsourcing what that need is. In other words, asking people with lived experience, asking people who are in the field or prospective members of the field, what do you need or what would you need in order for this to be successful? And that's important because creating an inequitable system where we say, well, we're open for business to everyone. Anyone can come join our chamber, or we're right here if you ever want us. That's not the same thing as saying, we want you and we will actively seek you out and make you a part of the community. So the idea about asking folks, what is it that you're not getting up to now that you could or should be getting that's going to move the needle in terms of you having access to markets or access to contracts or a forum in which you can network, liaise, or collaborate with your peers in the business community. Another really important point that's already been touched is language access. We have an incredible entrepreneurial spirit in our immigrant Vermonters, particularly in the refugee community. And so making sure that our services are tailored in a way that anybody, regardless of primary or preferred language, is able to participate fully and timely. And I say timely because oftentimes we'll do something like have an application for some program, but the translated materials don't come out until 5 days later. And at that point, the sort of savvy people, the early birds get that worm, and we end up through systems deprioritizing and disadvantaging other folks who should have had equitable access. So part of this work really is about identifying what are those specific tactics that we need to use to ensure equity, and then making sure that they're put into place. I recognize that we have a lot more to say and ask, and that we are short on time, so I'll leave it there, but I hope that that was a little bit of, I hope that that somehow helped to add to the conversation. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. It does, and I thank you for that. Does anybody have any questions for Ms. Davis? Okay, thank you very much for coming. Senator Rahm?
I love Gwen and the work she does. I also feel like Mark ends up being pulled in a lot of different directions every day. So I didn't know if we could hear from Mark Hughes from the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, because I imagine he's probably late to something else already.
Okay, Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And good morning to the committee. And shout out to Curtis and also Susana. Thank you for allowing me to come and speak to you today. My name is Mark Hughes. I am Executive Director of the Racial Justice Alliance. I'm also the founder and director of the Racial Equity Association, which is a consultancy here in Burlington. And I'm also the founder and creator of Vermont Cannabis Partners, which has been a company that's been on the books for a couple of years, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with it. I also have a history of founding a company called Eyes Inc., and I was a employee number 2 in a company called Pony Express, which was a VSEP program recipient and went on to be a multi-million-dollar company that came out of Barrie. So I come to you as an activist, but I also come to you as an experienced business person in the community. And I have concerns in both areas. The policy that I was asked to come and talk about in the specific section, being H159, section 12, I've come prepared to offer some testimony around it, but I want to meander a little bit because you've given me such a small scope to have this conversation within. And I really wanted to come and have a broader conversation with you about the policy on whole, but I will focus first and primarily on section 12 of the policy, just to be most productive in your committee. I think that where I would start with it is just to, Mr. Chair, I do want to just go back and at the top of the section 12, if if I could, I would just start with the intent. It said that the racial wealth disparities are a function of not only access to income, but also ability to start and sustain a business, access land, and own property. It goes on to say in point 2 that Vermont embraces its responsibility to course correct the historical impact of economic exploitation and exclusion from opportunity due to race and ethnicity for American descendants of slavery and broader Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. And then finally, it says that in order to rectify this history of inequity, it is the intent of this General Assembly to acknowledge and address wealth disparity and cultural disempowerment by creating economic opportunity and cultural empowerment using new systems that empower Vermonters who have historically suffered from discrimination and lacked equal access to public or private economic benefits due to race, ethnicity, geography, language preference, and immigration status. So that looks like the foundation, the premise. Clicking over really quick to findings, I just want to acknowledge the work of the Fairness, Diversity Partnership for Fairness and Diversity and those recommendations, allowing businesses to lead and define how to strengthen economic development for BIPOC-owned businesses and what organizational structures would best support Vermont BIPOC business community, offering more support to BIPOC businesses by assisting them in procuring state contracts and securing capital investment in customer cultivation, finding technical support, improving language access and cultural competency practices within state economic development programs. Now, I think I'd start on the policy. First of all, I am supportive of the initiative. I think is what is being called the project, rather. Just a couple of notes. One of the things, and I want to speak from the perspective of the Alliance, because as you know, the work of the Alliance, what we've been doing is seeking to clear obstacles for access to economic opportunity for Black and Brown folks, not the least of which would be, being able to build and grow businesses. I think the broader discussion here is what is the pipeline? What is the pipeline that actually takes a person from an idea to a business owner? Because I think there's a really narrow focus right now that's really just focusing on those who've already somehow or another achieved that status. So I want to just flag that as a concern. The observation that I have is that none of this is statute. So one of the things that concerns me is in what we're really focusing on is how do we really move the needle, Mr. Chair? How do we move the needle so we can really begin to change the structures that are the impetus to the challenges that we have? These are questions. I know you probably invited me for answers, but I came also to ask you some questions. Another question is as we're doing this work, is how do we do this in a work to acknowledge the systems that already exist? And I know that there's a vast amount of consideration that has been given to that because of your fiduciary responsibility as legislators, because you want to make sure that we are using the resources that we have appropriately. I understand that quite well, but that has to coexist with the fact that the existing systems are not serving a certain demographic adequately. And I think that's what I really would ask the committee to sit with. And I have the same conversations in all committees because this is true in housing. This is true in education. This is true in health services, which is why we created the BIPOC vaccination clinics and continue that work and so forth. I think you get the point. So this is the challenge. And I had a conversation with a colleague. Actually, it was the fact that sometimes there is a sense of urgency, and it seems that sense of urgency, when it is led by white political and economic power, it disadvantages Black folks. And then sometimes when there is a sense of delay, the same thing is true, that it disadvantages Black and Brown folks. Why? Because the political and economic power is always advantaged by the decisions that they make. So I think that what I do see by this particular project, by the way, I do support it. I want to be very clear that I support this project. But at the same time, I think it's more of a question of yes and. It's more of a question of what else can we do that has more of a sense of urgency, while we acknowledge the fact that there is a system that is not serving a particular demographic. So I'd refer you to H406, which is on the house on the wall in the house. And I would just ask you just to, if you take a look at that, because there are some, and what I'll do is we can talk a little bit more about that later, but there are some ideas that we proposed that we could actually implement that would cause some more immediate action in this area. Because again, here we are a state where we know that this is a very difficult time economically for Vermonters. What we know also is that Black and brown folks are affected first and worst every single time. So the pain that's being felt across the state is exacerbated in the Black and brown communities. So there should be a sense of an emergency in the solution that we're trying to propose. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a strategic plan that has some impact in the coming. I see that this project, a lot of it is, we're looking into 2022. We'll probably, and I'm being optimistic, be in 2023 before we actually get some traction on this. So I'm really being pragmatic. I'm really trying to say yes, and I believe that we can do more than one thing at the same time. I think we can. I think we can do some things. And I apologize because I was just on the Social Equity Caucus and I stayed late on that. And I'm going to blame Senator Rahm. No, I'm not going to do that. But I stayed late on that because I wanted to have an opportunity to speak. So I wanted to send over to you the language that was stricken or that was amended out of the bill before it crossed over. So having not done that and having it in front of me right now, what I would like to do is just simply just provide it to you just to kind of read it out. And what it sought to do is to amend Title 10. And over in Section 2, it says that the Agency of Commerce and Community Development shall design and implement the economic advancement program dedicated to at least one full-time equivalent employee to oversee the following responsibilities. Again, we know that something is not working. Perhaps this is something we could consider doing for something that could happen more immediately. The point number one under that is to cultivate and support BIPOC businesses, including 1, technical assistance, grants and loans, business-to-business mentorship programs, business procurement, contract assistance, financial management, digital growth and marketing, startup support, capital investment opportunities, and networking be kind of the component that we're talking about right now. Point number 2, it would provide training to business technical assistance providers to reduce bias in service delivery. And number 3, it would create a data collection system to allow the department to analyze trends, sectors, and outcomes for BIPOC businesses to better inform economic development policy that benefits BIPOC businesses. And number 4 is to create an outreach program that includes language access for the not fewer than 3 or most commonly used languages within Vermont other than English on all the programs offered to Vermont businesses within the agency. So this is just the language verbatim that was amended from the policy that you're looking at right now before it crossed over. So I would want to encourage the committee, and I will provide the committee this language to consider perhaps incorporating reincorporating, if you will, some of this language into this policy to provide some immediate impact and relief for, again, the first and worst, the folks who are impacted most in this, what we all understand to be incredibly difficult economic time for businesses here, small businesses here in Vermont. At the top of my testimony, what I told you was I was going to come back to a statement that was made in the intent, point number 2. It says, again, Vermont embraces its responsibility to course correct the historical impact of economic exploitation and exclusion from opportunity due to race and ethnicity for American descendants of slavery in the broader Black, Indigenous, and persons of color community. So that language also appears in H406. In fact, for those who are familiar with Title 10, there is in the purpose of Title 10, Section 3, it says that the Vermont statutes annotated state economic development programs are and assistance, that is economic development, means the process of generating economic and wealth, vitality, security, and opportunity for all Vermonters. Then it goes on to say that there are established the following 4 interrelated principles for future economic development of Vermont. So here in H406, the 5th one that we proposed in the amendment of this policy, correct, the historical impact of economic exploitation and exclusion from opportunity due to race and ethnicity for American descendants of slavery and the broader Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. This is statute. So this opportunity now, here as outlined in H406, to incorporate in its 4 principles a 5th principle, which really speaks directly to future and economic development in Vermont in a more inclusive manner. Further, in the language of Title 3, Section 3902, Title 3, Section 3902, here we see the economic, the Office of Economic, and just to say what I'm doing here is we're going after the structural challenges that are the impetus to what it is that we're trying to resolve. There's much more to do in ACCD and so forth. And oh, by the way, this is not a Black problem. This is a system problem. This is really not about, you know, us looking for ways in which Black and brown people can do things different, because we're not broken. The system is not serving us. It's serving a lot of other people quite well. So what we have to really get after, and we'll get into that in just a second, is how do we address that? And what I'm suggesting right now is a couple of foundational things that we can take a look at that could begin to turn the Titanic. So when folks go and look at these policies, because again, this is statute, it's not a project, okay? And oh, by the way, with all due respect, you know, it's my expectation that the legislature would be out of the business of projects and into the business of policy. So this is the reason why I'm here today is because I really think there's some good policy things that we can do in addition to the project that we're proposing here in this very, very limited $100,000, very tightly defined, scoped project out of an $11 million, $13 million policy that addresses this huge issue. So I want to go over to, again, this Title 3, 3902, and I'd ask you to consider this. I'd ask you, again, you can refer to H406 to get this language, but what we're talking about is the Director of Economic Opportunity being, quote, authorized to allocate available financial assistance for community services, agencies, and programs in accordance with state and federal law. And it goes on to say that in Section B that components of these services and activities may involve, without limitation, of other activities and supporting facilities designed to assist low-income participants. And it goes on a list of 10 things. One of those things is to secure and retain meaningful employment, obtain adequate education, and I will not go through that entire list, but I will offer to you the 11th one that we had proposed in an amendment. Again, we are in Title 3, foundational, to correct the historical impact of economic exploitation and exclusion from opportunity due to race, ethnicity, and of American descendants of slavery and the broader Black and Indigenous people of color community. So what we proposed in 406 is that in those two very, very foundational components of the statute in Title 10 and in Title 3, that we go in and we put our, we draw a line in the sand, the commitment that we've made that does not even hit statute in this proposed project, that we planted in statute in the foundational principles, as well as these supporting statements that are made here in Title 3, because then it also becomes an executive commitment in Title 3. So I want to go on to talk a little bit more about a proposal that we made in H406, because again, what we know is we have a system that's in place. And by the way, I would suggest that the project that we have in front of us in Chapter 12, in Section 12 of H159, presupposes a couple things. It first of all presupposes that we don't know how to provide economic opportunity to a certain demographic of folks. And I think, as Curtis said, we're not monolithic. And I would say that there are certain folks, because we're talking race class here, there are certain folks in this particular demographic are doing quite well. There are some who are not. And what I mean by that is it's not that all Black people, but there are a good portion of Black folks, and I apologize for my instability on my internet here. But what I'm getting at here is we do have a system that to some extent is working. And I think that's the challenge that the legislature, that you have as policymakers, you're saying, well, wait a minute, we got a system already, it's working, what's the problem? And then you got many Black and brown folks are saying, we're not seeing it. And what's frustrating is again, there's another $13.5 million of policy here that is going out into the community under the same system. So, but then we have a $100,000 project that seeks to fix it. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that there is a proposal on the table in H406, and it is called the Department of Cultural Empowerment and Economic Advancement. And in short, what it seeks to establish is a network, a network across the state that would provide satellite agencies or satellite organizations to provide certain services. These services include cultural empowerment programs to educate on the true history, contributions, and resilience of American descendants of slaves and other Black and Indigenous and other persons of color. This is part of an array of cultural empowerment activities. It would also have business cultivation and support programming, including small business technical assistance, small business grants and loans, small business business-to-business mentorship programming, technical assistance, and small business procurement contract assistance. And in the back of your head, you should probably be saying, we already have that. Look, that it's true to some extent. Some of this does already exist. Again, it's not serving the intended population. So we have three choices. We can either do something different. We can stay with the same model and do a project, or we can do two things at the same time. So, and some would say, well, this is going to be more expensive, and it could be unnecessarily. Here's the problem. Is we're in a situation where we know that we have a system that's not serving folks well. We're talking about, engaging them and getting ideas for them on how to fix it, when at the end of the day, the truth is that there's some internal work, some systemic racism mitigation work that has to happen across the entire state. This is just one instance, and I think Susana Davis would tell you, and I don't want to speak for her, would tell you the same, is that there's a reason why these services are not being delivered equitably, okay? And we're not going to fix that today. It's not going to happen. We will fix it, but it's not going to happen today. It's not going to get done before the year is over. But at the same, but meanwhile, we still have people in the community who are not being served, and this is economics, and that cuts to the bone. That's at the heart. So what we've created, what this system has created, is a need to expend additional resources to address this challenge. Yes, racism is expensive. It costs you more when you don't do it right. So I don't think it's ethical for us, and excuse the term, I don't mean to assault or attack anyone, but I don't believe it's ethical for me to assume that, on one hand, we can, acknowledge the fact that the systems are not serving everybody well, and have the resources to do something different, despite the fact that it costs more, and choose not to. So this is your challenge. This is your challenge. So we have H406 here. This is a proposal. Some of the other things is coordinating personal and professional development, because we do need adult basic education and career development and personal and career coaching in these same communities, and delivering wealth development and management planning and so on and so forth. That's what these 4 centers that would be geographically dispersed across the state, that's what they would deliver. This is our proposal. It's stuck there. I know you have the power to consider the language, to attempt to incorporate some of this language. Maybe you won't like some of it. We asked for a $10 million appropriation for this work. This is the work that I wanted to come to your community, to your committee, and talk to you about early in the session, the communications that you saw from me. I wanted to come and talk to you earlier. Water under the bridge, but now I'm here. I think that the last couple of things that I'll share with you, and I know you got to get going, is there are other components of this policy. And one has to do with a collaboration with the Economic Development Center for Emerging Technologies, Small Business Development Center, and other relevant stakeholders. And this is designing and implementing a BIPOC business development program. That's to increase the number of BIPOC businesses and provide business-owned, BIPOC-owned businesses with a broader access to capital. And then also to provide BIPOC-owned businesses with technical assistance. So those programming, there is a proposal to be able to move that forward relatively soon. The last couple of components is really about, one is about racial and social equity in business procurement programming. We need to get something on the books, Title 3, 2222, need to get something on the books that locks this in. Again, I haven't been around long, but what I do know is that if it doesn't hit a statute, we haven't done anything. What we've done is we've hit the white books and it blows by next year, and there's no stake in the ground. What this suggests is that the Secretary of Administration shall design and implement a business procurement program for all agencies, a BIPOC business procurement program. Put the stake in the ground and say, look, all agencies and departments within the state government, the purpose of which it's going to be to increase state government outreach to BIPOC-owned businesses for participation in bidding for government procurement contracts, to provide technical assistance and to BIPOC-owned businesses to seek and participate in these government procurement. And all I'm really doing is same thing Curtis told you, just put it in the statute and don't make it a recommendation. Make it a policy, make it a state policy, make a statement. Folks, this is what you're going to do. Because what? Because we've already acknowledged that there's an issue. We've said what we're trying to do, but we're not expressing our willingness to do so by putting a stake in the ground, by creating a statute instead of a project. So again, this is not an either or. I fully support the work that is brought before you in section 12. I am asking you to go further. I'm asking you to do more. I'm asking you to do something, to do two things at the same time. And I'm asking you to consider the sense of urgency that we're in. Now, I came into this this discussion. Let me just tell you the last thing is this: with the last piece of this policy, it really goes into requiring departments, the state, to implement policies and procedures designed to create pathways for career advancement. We know that this is career advancement for Black and brown folks. We know that in our state government, that the numbers are horrid as far as the employment numbers for Black and brown folks, their senior management numbers. So, you know, what we're asking in this policy for is to implement policies and procedures to create pathways for career advancement for current and future employees who are members of the BIPOC community. And finally, what we're also doing here is in collaboration with the Department of Labor and state colleges and the Vermont Training Program, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, design and implement continuing education and apprenticeship programs for BIPOC communities. So that pretty much concludes that. You know, when I came here for this testimony today, I was unprepared. The reason why is that when I started to, you know, really recognize and realize, you know, the impact of the Chauvin case, and I had to step back from it yesterday. And I was really shaken up this morning, and I've declined multiple press interviews, and we haven't made any public statements as of yet. This is a very, very challenging time for a lot of us. But this is also a time where we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to do something good. It's not enough to tell the police to stop killing us.
Mark,
Because at the end of the day, where we end up is that we're just not dead. Mr. Chair?
Yeah, I want to thank you very much for broadening the discussion beyond Section 12. It's something we needed to hear, and you did it very eloquently. We're going to need to move on, but I want to give an opportunity to committee members if they have any comments or questions.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, Senator Rahm.
So, Mark, I have a lot of thoughts on what you've laid out, and I have read H406. I'm reading through it again. In many ways, you know, it's a work of art. You know, it is the beginning of a conversation around reparations in this state, and I believe that's a conversation that many of us want to have. I am new to the Senate, but knowing that we don't even have a lot more time in all of our committees, I just want to say, you know, to you and to anyone watching, you know, from my own heart, I don't think we're going to be able to get there this session. But what I see is a really incredible foundation for a lot of BIPOC Vermonters, and particularly centering Black and Indigenous Vermonters, to maybe get some more resources to come together between now and next January and feel like we can incorporate this language in a way that gives them healing and makes them feel heard, and makes them feel a part of this bill and what it's trying to do. And I know you've been doing that, you know, with the folks that are around you, and I know you're one person, and it's really hard to carry as much as you've carried. So, you know, I will work to see if there's something in here that I feel like we could add resources to potentially. And I'm looking at a lot of people who have a lot more power than me in the Senate, you know, just to be able to say, how do we resource this conversation for people who've been doing work for free? And that's emotionally taxing. And that has been done, you know, without you all being compensated and supported through this work. You know, I think you laid something out, and you haven't, you know, had the time you wanted and needed in this committee and perhaps others to, and so I just want to honor that by saying, I think it's so important, and I think we will never do it justice in the next, you know, month of what we have before us in the Senate. But I am really committed to seeing if we can pull something out of it that resources you and resources people who've been doing exploited and uncompensated labor to help our state do better.
I appreciate that, Senator, and I think that if it stopped there, then we missed the whole point. I think the programming to build and the infrastructure to support Black and brown folks, from in this economic, in terms of not just small businesses, but also everything ranging from direct services through that, even through reentry, to be able to do it differently. You've pivoted to supporting folks like us. We're okay. Our budget is $300,000. When that's not what I came to petition this committee for. What I came to petition this committee for is clearing the obstacles for economic opportunity for Black and brown folks across this state.
Okay, good. Well, we appreciate your time and the thought. And as I said, it was very eloquent and well stated. We're going to move on to Gwen Picallo, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll hear from Joan Goldstein.
Yeah,
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Was great.
Welcome, Gwen.
Thank you so much. Good morning, committee. Happy snowy morning to you. It's great to see all of you, and it's an honor to be able to speak to this this important work. I'm with the Center for Women in Enterprise. As a reminder, we're Vermont's Women's Business Center. We receive federal funds from the Small Business Administration. We're partially funded through that program to provide no-cost business counseling throughout the life of a business statewide, as well as a ton of different training and cohort building experiences to women across the state. We do serve all gender identities. We just know that women face particular challenges in the economy. And I'd love to just start with a couple of statistics to talk about the unique challenges that especially Black women-owned businesses face. It comes back to some of the items in this conversation today. Black women-owned businesses are growing and starting at something like 6 times the rate nationally than white-owned businesses. And Latina-owned businesses are starting at something like 4% or 4 times more than white-owned businesses. And they tend to start businesses in those industries that Vermont that are growing in Vermont and that make Vermont what we know Vermont can be. Black women tend to have a higher rate of starting side hustles than in the white population. And we also know that women tend to have a higher portion of women tend to have a side hustle. So in coming back to this,
Okay, I'll bite. What's a side hustle?
What's a side hustle?
That's a question. Yeah, so you might hear it referred to as a gig, or it's something that's happening outside of traditional employment. So for example, maybe I have a job at so-and-so, and I also have a side catering business that I do on nights and weekends. That's a side hustle.
What most of Vermont calls a second job.
Exactly, moonlight in Vermont or starve. And so it's essentially what we used to call moonlighting. Side hustles, though, tend to be a much more involved and dedicated experience. So thank you for that clarification. So in coming back to this proposal, I think it's a great start. I also would be remiss if I didn't talk about the SBA Community Navigators program that will be coming out. So I know you talked with Darcy, I think Monday or Tuesday. I'm not sure if she mentioned it, so I'll just quickly go over those.
She did mention
talk about it?
Yeah, she
Okay.
did.
Okay, so the parameters have not yet been set, but it'll be administered by the SBA, and it's the program, as a reminder, is to really leverage the existing networks, resources by lifting up and giving voice and resources to those networks and organizations that are not currently a part of what we always talk about in the economic development sphere. So I think that's really an important program for us to all be aware of when we're thinking about this bill, especially because there has to be collaborative efforts. And I think that when these efforts come out, they tend to be piecemeal, and there's less connection between they're kind of discrete projects. I think Mark's remarks about this, making sure that this doesn't turn into a project, but rather that we build as a state an appetite for pilots and then follow through afterwards. And so there are significant resources that are going to come to the state through the SBA Community Navigators program. When paired with this particular program, I think that there's an important place for the state to provide convening power and also requirements for what those programs will entail. Everybody has talked about the need for state contracting. I want to echo that. It is, I think that the state could really benefit from having state set-aside requirements, much like the federal requirements to source from small business-owned firms, and then certainly firms owned by the BIPOC community and by women. I think in so doing, it'll keep a lot of money here in our economy. And we are often asked two things. One, where are there markets that reflect my business here in Vermont? And we know that many businesses, especially in Southern Vermont, as Curtis said, a lot of the people of color who own businesses, their markets are actually in Albany, or in Boston, or in New York. Those dollars are not necessarily staying here. And there are a lot of dollars that are staying here. So let's highlight them, right? Let's source products and services from those businesses where possible. The second thing that we have been asked about in record numbers is about grants and financial products to support Black women-owned businesses and general BIPOC-owned businesses. And it's been kind of heartbreaking. The state did a wonderful job as much as it could over the summer, right? And it's been heartbreaking. We are still getting inquiries from people asking about the Women and Minority-Owned Business grant program. And there aren't grants available now, right? And so I know we're working on that. I really think that looking at the financial products that are available to the BIPOC-owned community, business owner community, is imperative. We know that there are collateral inequities, that there's a series of wealth inequities that make it very, very difficult for people of color to access funds. And those the rates that they often pay for, typically that they pay for loans, for example, are significantly higher than white-owned businesses because of the collateral issues, and those systemic issues. There might be some opportunity here in looking at some of the technical assistance cost sharing models or grant models around getting services to BIPOC-owned businesses. So NCIC up in the Northeast Kingdom does a fantastic program that has been utilized by many clients of the Center for Women in Enterprise, whereby they will cost share something like getting a website done. Okay, so the entrepreneur puts a certain amount in, NCIC covers the rest. Now, of course, they do vetting and things like that, but that might be a model that we really want to look at. It's been very successful, and why not doing it across the state, and why not consider doing it, doing specialized programming for people of color? I think two additional things I just want to share with you are that there is distrust of institutions. And so when thinking about the Secretary of State database, we just want to go in with that mindset that there is a distrust of institutions, and that data needs to go somewhere. We need to make sure that we're not just collecting data for data's sake, and that we are moving it into a set-aside requirement program or something like that. And the final thing is that these networks do exist, and that leveraging there are many informal networks in the way that I think, would talk about them in more institutionalized groups. And so these networks exist. You heard from the other presenters today that those networks are giving free labor and leveraging the resources to really support what's already happening, I think is going to be really important, that this stuff doesn't happen in a silo.
Okay. Gwen, would you be willing to write up a one-pager with your ideas and send it to the committee? And the question I have for you is, take a look at the language that you probably have. And it sounds like a lot of your ideas are things that this consultant will be looking at almost generically or organically. But the one thing that I wonder your thoughts on is this new navigator system. Do you see a need to change some language here to cross-reference some specific utilization or targeting of that program? I don't get the sense in my years in this job that the federal government and its silos necessarily talk as best as they can to ACCD, and becomes very separate. And I'm wondering if, in your opinion, whether there should be some language that directs this consultant to look at how this new SBA program can be utilized or not. Do you have any feel on that?
I'd love to get back to you, but initially, I think it's imperative that the two programs at least talk to each other. And I can imagine that this consultant will do a lot of convening and a lot of on-the-ground research and conversations. That's kind of the foundation of the SBA Community Navigators program, is that it relies on what already has been convened. Does that make sense?
Well, I just don't want to, I mean, they have a lot of resources, even though the program is relatively small compared to all the other money they're giving out. I hate to lose out on those resources to supplement this $100,000.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We're going to take unless people have questions for Gwen, we're going to take we'll come back at 10:10. And we'll pick up with Joan till 10:45.